And it's a beautiful morning here in California. I guess all that climatic turbulence of last year, the last few years, is abated for the moment. Are we out of all those dynamic weirdnesses? We'll find out about that in a second.
We are still feeling the impacts of the drought.
Yeah, that's right. My name is Andy Revkin. I've been writing about the climate system and the human system and their kind of intersection since the mid-1980s. Mostly for the New York Times, as you might have read, Bret Stephens, the New Times columnist, kicked off his opinion writing at the Times with a big thing on climate, including some citations of me. I wish he had cited more of my articles that he mentioned, but we'll get into that. Certainty was the issue there, and there's been a lot of noise around that word and the word uncertainty. Those two words have been abused for decades in this discourse. But we'll try to get some clarity amid the calls for certainty and uncertainty and delay here. I now am at ProPublica, where our mandate is all the stories that we do have to have moral force and it's accountability journalism with moral force. So numbers matter, data, and I try to pay attention more to what's actually happening than what people are saying is happening. That's kind of our goal there. And so I want to just frame this very quickly. The mandate was about 10 years. What do we do in the next 10 years? But it's worth framing this, I think, over the last 30 years in the context of the next 30. Partially because climate change is defined roughly in 30-year components. That's the climate of today is the climate of roughly a 30-year period, more or less. And 30 years ago, next year, 1988, was when global warming really became a story. Jim Hansen testified, Yellowstone caught on fire, big drought and heat in the Midwest and in Europe. Carbon dioxide was at 350 parts per million in the atmosphere for the last time in anyone's lifetime here, and probably many more lifetimes to come. And the IPCC was created that year. There was this first meeting on the first meeting. There was the international meeting on the changing atmosphere happened in Toronto that year. I was there, and there was this guy from the Maldives. Their UN mission guy was walking around looking a little lost, like, is anyone going to listen to me here? This is a very low island in the Indian Ocean. And ever since then, there's been this tension between the countries that are most vulnerable, the ones that are most powerful, the ones that have emitted the most, and the ones that have emitted the least. Paris is this highly imperfect, but perfect in many ways, perfectly human solution for the moment. It's a journey-style treaty as opposed to a contract-style treaty. And here we go. We're going to start with some science, very brief primer, update on the basics of the science and how it does and doesn't inform society. Noah Diffenbaugh over here from Stanford University's Woods Institute. We'll start things off in a second. Here's Bob Inglis, a former member of member of Congress from South Carolina, 1993 to 99, Republican. And now he runs an organization called Republican, en.org, which is trying to find a path for that conservatives can embrace that deals with climate realities. To my left, from the Brookings-Tsinghua Center in Beijing is Yaki, and we'll get a picture from Asia from him and also Asia's interactions with the rest of us. Diane Regas, who's the executive director of the Environmental Defense Fund. And at the far end, we have from Exxon Mobil, Peter Trelenberg, who leads their Office of Environmental Policy and Planning. And Exxon, has been in the thick of things in many ways for a long time, for better and worse. And we'll see how what role can be played there going forward. But back to the science first. So Noah, can you kick things off with a brief update? And again, maybe start with California. Like, it was so weird these last few years, but in a way it was not weird at all, right? These big flooding events, paleoclimate records show this is kind of California, but, yes, and then there's a but.
Well, yeah, so Andy talked about 1988, and Andy actually had an article in Discover magazine, the cover article from 1988. And when I talk about the California drought, actually my closing slide every time I talk about it is a picture from that 1988 article. So I was in 8th grade in 1988. My climate science career was just starting. And so it's really humbling, I think, in the literal sense of the word humbling, not the more general, say it every time you tweet sense of the word humbling, but actually humbling for me to see that article from 1988 and realize that pretty much everything that you laid out in 1988, from talking to scientists like Jim Hansen and Peter Gleick, it's really, I mean, that was pretty much spot on for what's happened in the real world over the last 30 years or so. And one of the things that was spot on was kind of Peter Gleick's projections of how global warming would influence the water resources in California. And essentially our water resources are, about 30% of our water resources in California have been dependent on snowpack, and Peter hypothesized that as global warming unfolds, California's water resources will become more liquid dominated, that we would get earlier melting of snow, more rain as opposed to snow, particularly at lower elevations, that this would cause more flooding during the winter because we'd be losing that flood control from snowpack, more water deficits during the summer. And I'm telling you, 1988, there's this picture in that Discover magazine article. It's exactly what's happened over the last 30 years. And our work on the California drought has shown that, in fact, that warming of California has doubled the odds of drought years, because what it does is it means that when we have low precipitation, we're very likely to have warm temperature, and that means that, again, more melting of snow, more drawing of moisture out of soils, out of vegetation. So, that's one example of an extreme event where we know that global warming has been playing a role, and this has been corroborated by many different research groups over the last few years. My group had a new paper come out a week ago, last Monday, where we tried to take the kind of work that we've done on the California drought and take a more global view and ask everywhere in the world for these record-setting events, has global warming played a role? If we just take any location in the world and ask that question. And what we found is that for the hottest events, global warming has had an influence on the record hot event at more than 80% of the surface area where we have reliable observation. So the answer to, are these extreme events influenced by global warming? For hot events, the answer is yes. Not 100% of the time. The world's not yet at the point where every record hot event has been influenced by global warming, but we're getting close. And for extreme wet and extreme dry events, it's about half of the surface area where we have reliable observations. So that's an update on where the science has come over the last 3 decades. I think for the future, this panel's focused on the next 10 years. Just in one sentence, I think there are, we have 3 big challenges globally. We are going to need to double energy, total energy supply, and increase energy access. That's a big challenge. All else being equal, that's a big challenge. In order to meet the Paris Agreement, we're going to need to decarbonize the energy system. That's just the fundamental physics of the global climate system. To stabilize global temperature, stabilize sea level, we need to decarbonize the energy system, net zero energy system. And third big challenge is we're going to have to catch up with the climate change that's already happened and get ahead of the climate change that's going to come between now and increasing energy supply fourfold and decarbonize the energy system. There's going to be some more climate change in that time. So that's where I see the global challenge over the next decade and the decades after that.
Can you bring up, there's one of the, I did this interview, a video interview you can find on YouTube with a couple of long-timers from MIT, John Riley and Jake Jacoby. I've been studying this stuff since the 80s too. And we talked about the what are the biggest misperceptions of the science of climate that relates to climate policy. And one of them is that even if we had a really good policy on emissions that drove those rates down as the treaty would imply, there's commitment. The system doesn't notice that for decades, literally decades. And this is where having an integrated look at risk seems really important. Like if you go to, I've tried to focus on sub-Saharan Africa a lot because there's no more vulnerable place on the planet to climate hazards, wet or dry. And there the science has been durably unclear about what the CO2 impact will be on wetness or drying. And see, that's when those who say of the science we don't know anything, they miss that. That's what I've been starting to call a known unknowable. And they're there. Yeah. And so the vulnerability reduction there has nothing to do with emissions reduction. It doesn't mean that emissions reduction isn't important. It's just that between now and 2070, for example, the main driver of vulnerability is population growth and poverty.
Yeah, so the climate risk really results from the intersection of the physical hazard, whether it's hot, dry, wet, whatever that tornadoes in the U.S. This week. That physical hazard, how that intersects with exposure and vulnerability, right? And so population, infrastructure, ecosystems, right? Those are all, there's exposure varies across the globe now, and exposure will vary in the future, how that future unfolds. And then vulnerability, we know, plays a huge role in that risk profile. And all three of these dimensions are present opportunities for managing climate risks. And I think that
but on different time scales. In other words, you can address the other vulnerability issues right now, but the energy mitigation doesn't do that.
Absolutely. So there's no question that we are not adapted to the climate that we have right now. And
right.
As an example here in the US, look at the last decade, we've had more than 80 climate and weather disasters that have each caused at least $1 billion in damage. Some of them have caused multi-billion dollars in damage. We've had many others that have caused less than $1 billion. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in a decade. And so we are not here in the U.S. where we have as good a shot at reducing our vulnerability as possible in terms of our resource availability.
We're still
we're not adapted to the climate that we have right now. I think so I teach a class, a freshman seminar called the Global Warming Paradox, and the main goal of the class is that by the end of the 10-week quarter that the students can answer the question, what is the global warming paradox? Why is this? What the heck does that mean? Yes, it's a very inefficient class, but we're focused on learning goals. So we've got one. But the paradox is, I think, it really gets the heart of what you've just said, is that for large populations on planet Earth right now, the most direct way to decrease their vulnerability to climate stresses is to increase their energy consumption. And the easiest way to increase your energy consumption is through fossil fuel use. And that you've written a lot about that on the .earth blog. And that's really the heart of the paradox, is that there are billions of people living in energy poverty now, and that creates tremendous vulnerability to the climate system and tremendous barriers to human development. And that's an imperative that just can't be denied, whether it's on ethical grounds or on practical grounds.
Okay. So now we're going to move to the political climate, which is, I guess, more turbulent and unpredictable than the biogeophysical climate. So what's going on at Republic N? And to my mind, looking at these issues, vulnerability reduction is one where libertarians and liberals could easily agree. It seemed to happen briefly, like with the Biggert-Waters bill on rationalizing flood insurance. And then, of course, voters said, oh my God, flood insurance is costing too much. So, but then there's energy. There's all kinds of opportunities for agreement on energy among people who will fight to the death on global warming. So what's your role now? What do you see as a path forward here in this turbulent moment?
Well, I think we're witnessing the collision between populism and conservatism, and it's ongoing. And as a conservative, I'm very happy to be in the conservative car, because if there's going to be a head-on collision, conservatism has a frame to it. Populism really is quite plastic. And when these collide, I think conservatism will do very well. And so what we at republicen.org try to do is convince conservatives to raise their hand in Noah's class and say, we've got an answer. The problem is that conservatives think they're no good when it comes to energy and climate. So every time Andy talks to me about this silly marathon he wants me to run in, I change the subject, right? Because I don't want to run 26 miles. It's silly to run 26 miles.
That must be another Andy.
Yeah. So, so that's what conservatives have been doing, is they don't think they got an answer. And so the environmental left looks down their nose at them, shines their halo and tells us conservatives we're sinners. And that sort of ends the conversation. But what we live to do is encourage conservatives to step up, raise your hand. You got the answer. It's simply internalizing negative externalities. I once said that to the Greenville News, the largest newspaper in the district that I represented. The reporter stopped me. He said, "What'd you say?" And I said, "Internalize the negative externalities." He said, "I can't write that in this paper, man. We write at the 7th grade level." And I said, "Reveal the hidden cost." Next day in the paper it said, Inglis said, "Reveal the hidden cost." So, but anyway, all we got to do is convince people, convince conservatives that you're really good. You get good ideas. Mm-hmm. You're great. You know to internalize negative externalities. And then, after we overcome that inferiority complex on the right, we think that many on the left who agree, for example, Al Gore, who's been for this for about 30 years, will be able to pull America together and we'll solve this challenge. Mm-hmm. And by the way, so what we're really talking about is a carbon tax that is revenue neutral, which fits with conservative values and also fits with what Al Gore's been for about 30 years. It's also crucial that it be border adjustable, which we think fits with the current sense in America that we're not going to go to the UN and beg and bow and scrape. We're just going to make America lead. And the way America leads here is saying, you want access to our market? Fine. We want to trade. It's just when your goods come in here, you're going to pay the carbon tax unless you had the same one back home. Now, we expect that to be challenged in the WTO, but based on precedents in the chemical industry, we think there's every reason to believe that we can win in the WTO. Mm-hmm. And then 24 hours later in China, they've got the same price on carbon dioxide. And then the whole world is following. No international agreement, just bold leadership by the United States. I think, I was critical earlier of populism, but I tell you, I just wrote a piece for Real Clear Science that is a Trump speech. I think what I've just said, it's border adjustable, revenue neutral carbon tax, can be put in Trumpian. And I did so in this Real Clear Science piece, where it basically says it's an America First message. Yeah. And so it can either be put diplomatically or it can be put a little bit more in your face. Either way, we get to the same place, and America leads, and we challenge the world to solve, or we lead the world to solve this challenge.
So is anyone having that conversation with the Trump administration?
We'd like to.
Is there a Trump administration?
Well,
the Washington Post has this amazing feature on how few people have been actually nominated even for.
But there's one very important one, and I hope that Pete will talk to us about this. Is Rex Tillerson? We think is the key to this. Because Rex Tillerson has the right answer on climate change, and from our perspective at Republic-en.org, mm-hmm. and thankfully so does Darren Woods, his replacement at Exxon Mobil, and so it's pretty exciting to have that kind of leadership in place. So we hope that Rex Tillerson is the answer to that question you just asked.
But there's that underlying thing about how much the costs. It's about the hidden costs being internalized. And Jim Mattis, Secretary of Defense Mattis, I did a piece that got the private responses to the Senate committee, where he did reveal that he said some very strong things about climate change. But even there are still questions about whether that is making it into the circles it needs to go to make a difference. So we'll see, because the Trump administration says there's essentially no social cost of carbon. Scott Pruitt has, as Brett Stevens. The argument is, well, we don't know. Well, let's keep talking. How does this fit there realistically?
Well, I think back to that,
or you have to wait them out.
That collision between populism and conservatism. It is the case that we are upset about globalization, automation, and those concerns cause people to have legitimate concerns that we don't need to belittle. But it will, and it sounds like maybe I am belittling because I'm saying there's going to be this collision, but once people find out that the coal jobs, for example, aren't coming back, that it has to do with not repealing the price on natural gas, which is a little bit harder to do than repealing the Clean Power Plan, is that at that point, it's a teachable moment. We have to have compassion for these people that are in that spot of in coal, let's say, and they don't know what else to do. We happen to think they're conservative answers like offer relocation assistance to pick up and move to Texas, where there's some jobs going wanting in similar kinds of work. But that collision is coming between populism and conservatism. Let's hope it comes in a way that leads to productive outcomes, where we say, okay, now we understood your angst. It's completely understandable why you're upset. Now let's help find solutions.
All right. So is China, have they jumped into the lead position here? I've read articles saying, well, this is a great opportunity for China to move into the driver's seat on international policy on climate. In the context of this 10-year question, where do you see China fitting in a way that might not have been the case the last 10 years?
I think there is no need for China to jump because it's already in the leadership position. When the President of the United States decided not to work on climate change, I want to respond to this approach of internalizing the externalities. Yeah. First of all, I like that approach. I think we can find a huge agreement over there here in the community. And also, for one, I really like that idea of a carbon tax, a domestic carbon tax and border control, border adjustment, yeah. Carbon tax. I think that also work for the case of China as well. I do believe it would work here in the United States. I also believe that will work in China. So EDF might have a different take. We can talk about that on the carbon market. Currently, China is creating the largest carbon market in the world. Actually, already, it's, with the 7 pilots, already we have a largest carbon market in the world. The plan is by the end of this year, 2017, China will have the huge carbon market to cover a nationwide carbon market. We're talking about 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions each year that under the coverage of this carbon market. But I think for a country like China with that system, the political and economic system, I actually think we should not rule out this idea of a carbon tax. First of all, it's much easier to implement and much clearer and have a broader coverage, and it can be really you can make it, design it with the revenue neutral, right. And I think this is something currently China is not considering, but I do think it's a good idea to consider. Also, I think it is a good idea to find the common ground between the President of China and President of the United States. They're talking about this border adjustment, carbon tax. Right. And I think a possible area to discuss would be, on what principle we're going to implement this border adjustment. Are we going to do it on a consumption-based, or are we going to do it on the production-based? And China, for sure, wants to prefer a consumption-based, right? So that way, the U.S. would be paying more on the carbon tax border adjustment, and the U.S. probably wants to go more on the production base. I think that's just something that can be discussed, actually. But overall, China wants to work on this issue of climate change. Noah just told us about the science, and the Paris Agreement has agreed that we have a target of 2 degrees Celsius, hopefully 1.5 degrees Celsius. But that 2 degrees Celsius for China, translated into the case in China, we're talking about not 2 degrees, not 2.5 degrees for China. China will have more impact of climate change on China. So 3 years ago, when then Secretary of State John Kerry was discussing with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, and she replied to him, she said, we really want to work on this climate change issue, not really because you guys want us to work on it, but because we really, really need to do it. And there is another major concern for this issue, which is the domestic air pollution, right? That EDF has been working with China ever since the late 1990s. So, these issues actually come together. And
They can, yeah.
China
Not
does
always,
have
yeah.
opportunity to lead, but I don't think that's just, you want to take the leadership per se. You really want to solve the problems you have, right?
We'll probably get to a little bit more of this in a minute, but there seem to be some opportunities in terms of America now being such an abundant, having abundant supplies of natural gas, and Secretary Perry just opened up LNG export terminal. If more of that could help China, presumably, if that is part of it, move away from coal more rapidly. But we'll talk about that. And I wanted to ask you, though, about R&D, cooperation on research. Carbon capture and storage is this persistent out clause, a solution that kind of bubbles up every time things get hard. And for years, scientists, MIT and others have worried that the level of R&D is completely insufficient to even know whether capturing carbon and putting it in the ground at gigaton scale is even doable. But it seems to be an opportunity where China and the United States could cooperate on that kind of research. I don't know if that plays a role for you.
I think that's actually an ongoing development already ever since November 2009 when then President Obama was visiting China. He signed 5 agreements. All of them have to do with this R&D, whatever. The energy is the focus area. Back then, there were 3 sub areas: building energy efficiency,
Right.
clean coal, then also on the transportation, the vehicles, and later they added yet another area was the water energy nexus. And that has been going on, and they have been working on many issues, how you can actually deal with the intellectual property with that.
Which is a big one. Right?
Yeah, which is
And in India,
really a
too.
big one. I think this is the area, I believe it has been going on very, very nicely. With a lot of development. If you look at the carbon emission reduction last year, the last couple of years, it's really great, right? The 2014, when Obama and Xi Jinping was meeting, they were talking about to have the peak emission around 2030. But what happened is 2015, already we began to see a decline of carbon emission in China. I think a lot of that having to do with this technological progress, and some of them might have to do with this joint development of between these two countries, and also in the United States. Last year, 3% of reduction of carbon emission.
Yeah.
I think it's really great. I personally am quite optimistic about it.
You're right.
Right.
So, Diane, what's the role of environmentalism in all of this, and how do you choose your priorities when there's so many fronts in the war?
It's a pretty big, complex
Yeah.
problem. To talk about that, I want to look first backwards, because I think one of the issues in climate change is sometimes we don't appreciate how much progress has been made. If you look at emissions, they went up and up and up since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And over the last 3 years globally, emissions look like they've leveled off. And now the challenge for us is how can we drive them downwards? But maybe we've hit the peak. We don't know for sure. We won't know for a while. But maybe we've hit that peak. And let's just talk about what that looks like. I'm going to pick one little country, United Kingdom. What is that, 4th or 5th biggest economy in the world? If you look back at 1990, carbon emissions from the UK have gone down by 40%, and their economy has doubled.
That's coal to gas, right?
A lot of it's coal to gas. A lot of it, and I'll talk about gas in a minute, because the drivers of the technology development, whether it's horizontal drilling and fracking, or driving down the cost of solar and wind, which are 10 times less expensive today than they were 10 years ago, which is phenomenal, is having a huge impact. So Portugal, another little country, had 4 days where they used no fossil fuels at all to run their electricity system. Now that's really hard to do, and figuring out how to do that actually requires not only energy generation, storage, but actually some of the most modern information management and market tools to make that work. So we've had beginnings of the decrease in peaking in emissions. We've had improvements in technology. And that makes me optimistic as well. And as we look forward, what has to happen? What do environmental groups do? I really see there's 3 main areas where we need to work, and none of it is alone. There's not any institution, not any environmental group, not the World Bank, not China, not the United States, not the international community that can solve this problem alone. So we all have to be working, thinking about the context. But there's 3 areas that I would highlight. The first one is ongoing leadership at an international scale. That means moving forward with Paris, which raised the world's ambition for what we could accomplish. But it doesn't just mean Paris. There's a lot of international work within companies, between countries, one-on-one, and environmental groups can play an important role in helping to identify opportunity, analyze what can happen. So that's the first thing, is ongoing international work to raise ambition. The second thing I would highlight that's so important is how do we get the markets to reward the people and the companies and the countries that are doing well. And there's been a little bit of debate already on carbon tax and cap and trade. Yeah, we've always favored cap and trade, but more importantly, we favor policies that reward those innovators that get out there and get the results that we need. And carbon tax is one way to do it. Cap and trade has been very successful here in California at driving down emissions at a very low cost. You know, if we use the cost estimates to set a carbon tax, we'd actually probably set it a lot higher than what we found through cap and trade actually is the cost of reducing emissions so far. But I don't think that there's any single solution either, because these are incredibly complex problems. And if you think about how do we need to get markets to work in our favor, it's not just the price, right? Markets need transparency. Markets need a whole lot of other tools. And it's really exciting to see those begin to be adopted in jurisdictions around the world. The state of Illinois here in the United States just adopted some new rules that allow private investors to come in new ways in the electricity system. Bring the transparency, the information sharing. So if you think about this as a market, and not just is it cap and trade or carbon tax, but what's the market that can help us drive the progress we need? Even that, as big as it is, I don't think is the whole solution. There are a lot of these issues that we don't yet know how to use market tools, and actually that gets us to natural gas. Methane emissions from the natural gas system are an incredibly important driver of climate change. If you look at the climate change we're experiencing,
and agriculture.
And agriculture. If you look
More
at the
so.
climate change we're experiencing now, 20% of the warming we're experiencing today is from methane emissions, from agriculture and from natural gas system. Natural gas system, we actually know how to reduce those emissions quite cheaply, about a penny per 1,000 cubic feet of gas, so a tiny cost compared to the overall price.
Yeah.
And so, but how do we do that? Right now, it looks like standards that say, all right, if you achieve this standard, you're good. Innovate, find the cheapest way to get there. That's the best we know today on how to achieve those emissions reductions. They're cheap, we know how to do it, and a lot of countries are actually stepping up to begin to make that happen.
Yeah.
So I think Mike Bloomberg just authored a book, which I recommend to you, and one of the points that he makes throughout with Carl Pope, who used to be head of Sierra Club, is that climate change actually offers huge opportunities for ways to make society better off in multiple ways, increase prosperity, and address climate change. And those are the opportunities we need to look for and advocate for throughout the world.
Okay. So oil and gas, we've heard this, and scale. One of the big things people miss about your industry is it does big things. And this relates to this carbon capture question. There's no one around who could do something at that scale other than that kind of industry. And oil, you know, inertia, I'm trying to cast this set of pieces going forward, and this is we're at 30 years now, on what are the hidden villains that get missed in our look, and when we're looking around for blaming, and one of them is inertia, and scale is another one. Scale, and that's what often gets missed in here. Heading towards zero, to stabilize emissions of an enduring gas, you have to go to zero later in the century. As humanity goes past 9 billion, all wanting decent lives. And oil is going to be needed for a long time to come. Car fleets don't just magically turn into Priuses or EVs. Yeah. So what is the role of the oil industry going forward, and gas, you know, in this arena?
Yeah, I'm going to circle back, and I'll probably hit commentary on just about everybody.
Have a conversation.
The advantage of, you know, kind of going last here, but you know, we look out. I think 10 years is a little short, so we tend to look longer term, and we make long-term investments at scale in this industry. So we look at our energy outlook, and no doubt energy improves lives. All what we see around us, air conditioning, lights, cell phones, all that comes from the access to energy. So energy improves lives. So we have that challenge of how do you provide energy for a growing world that is getting richer and address climate change. And that's a huge, huge challenge, and that's all of us work in that space in various places. Just a quick fact, 3 billion more middle-class consumers by 2040. There's about 2 billion middle-class consumers now. There's going to be about 5 billion now. About 1 billion more in China, 1 billion more in India, and 1 billion more in the rest of the developing world. Those are all people who want the things that we all take for granted. So, you know, providing that energy is important. So how do you do that and reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Electrification ends up being a very, very powerful strategy. Efficiency, hugely, hugely important to get more efficient. We, since 1970, globally have gotten about 1% per year more efficient in what we do, sort of energy per GDP. That's got to double or triple. We think it'll double, and accelerating that rate of efficiency gain, huge opportunity, area where you see a tremendous amount of work going on now. So, you know, lots of work in new technologies, whether it's new IT technology or whether it's new products and services, all of that hugely important. Lower carbon energy sources, very important as well, all across the board. Natural gas, 60% less CO2 emissions when you're generating electricity with it. Also a huge opportunity, not just in power. Everybody thinks about power. Industry, so switching industry to natural gas, switching residential and commercial space to natural gas. There's still about half the energy used in the residential commercial space is primitive biomass.
Yeah,
There's a whole lot of, you've written about that, and, you know, whole lot of other health issues, but probably the biggest environmental health issue there is in the world is using primitive biomass to cook, you know, in the least developed world. So huge opportunity to make people's lives better, provide energy, and address climate change. So big opportunity, and natural gas helps with that. Not the end game, but a huge opportunity and does a lot.
Can I ask you one thing on that arena? I've been looking into this issue of energy access in poor countries, and there's been the diversion into this cleaner cook stove arena, using biomass more cleanly, but there's lots of problems there. But I've talked to people in the oil and gas sector in places where LPG can be available. LPG is those, you know, white canisters we all have under our grills, and they're a global, ubiquitous possibility. But what I hear from often is that industry's job in places like that, for the bottom billion or two, hasn't been to develop markets. It's been to focus on, you know, the people who are already middle class. Is there a role for industry in helping figure out a business model at that scale for those 2 billion people who don't have a bank account necessarily, or who might have a micropayment account?
Yeah, you need to, certainly, for us at the scale, providing access to that. But, and then that whole local distribution network needs to be developed.
Yeah.
And, that usually is
And it's
done
kind of-
best by local people.
And it is fragmented, I
But
know.
it
There's
is, yeah,
many
it's very
layers between-
fragmented, so very hard
Yeah.
for us to work on something, local like that. Best done locally, most effectively done locally.
Right.
And, actually tends to help local economies as well and local entrepreneurship as well. So we tend to support local entrepreneurship and get people, into that type of business as well as lots of other businesses where we operate. But a big opportunity to
Yeah.
make people's lives better. I want to talk about the role of technology in general, and two technologies where we work, where we think there has not been enough investment. One is carbon capture and storage. And there is no question that that will be a technology that is needed. And a couple of reasons. One is it's reasonably cost effective. So about $100 a ton of CO2 avoided, we could be doing carbon capture and storage now. And that'll vary with location and vary with, exactly what you're doing and where you have to store. But, that's not unreasonable compared to some of the other things that we're seeing in the market now. Right now, we don't see the incentives there. Circling back to what Bob was saying is, you don't see the incentive necessarily to drive that, the introduction of that. Where we do see the incentives, it is practiced. We practice it up in Norway, for instance, where there's about an $80 or $90 a ton carbon tax for emissions.
Right.
So that's hugely important because we think it'll be cost effective. Second of all, you need it, I think, almost certainly for industry. So if you think about a world where efficiency is valued,
Yeah.
which is a carbon-constrained world, you'll need petrochemicals and those kinds of, those actually are valuable products because they bring efficiency through the value chain. It's hard to imagine how you're going to decarbonize, a big industry like that without some amount of carbon capture and sequestration. And then lastly, if we really do have ambitions to get down to these very low CO2 levels, you need technologies that allow you to take carbon out of the atmosphere.
Right.
And there are ways that you can use carbon capture and sequestration as a tool to allow you to help do that. So hugely important. We do a lot of our own research in that area, and I think an area that needs to be recognized as an important part of the mix, not the solution, but a part of the mix of solutions.
Yeah.
And then lastly, biofuels. Biofuel technology is another area that hasn't been invested in enough as far as the fundamental science. Another area where we do a lot of work, we look at algae. And the reason we look at that is we think it's scalable. So you mentioned scale. Scale is always difficult. People underappreciate the scale of the energy system. So we think it's scalable, and we think it stays out of the sort of the food-water nexus. You can use brackish water or gray water and stay out of the competition for food. And when you think we're going to have 9 billion people and they're going to be more wealthy, they're going to need food, and so staying away from that nexus we think is important.
Yeah.
And hard to imagine that you don't need some kind of a liquid fuel for things like aviation,
Right.
heavy-duty trucking, long haul. So wherever energy density is important, you're probably going to need that kind of technology. So.
Right. And on that front, I've written since 2006. It's kind of like become like a Groundhog Day phenomenon about underinvestment in basic science, underinvestment in basic R&D in fields related to energy.
Yes.
And not just energy, but other systems that are important for sustainability, like agriculture, which can relate to energy. And it's been a Republican and Democrat thing. There's no, when you look at the graphs of disinvestment in basic science, there's no kind of wiggle for Republican and Democratic administrations. What's the solution there? How do we get this country engaged with the need for frontier science, even as we're trying to facilitate access to today's renewables and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's such an easy target, isn't it? For example, you can say the woolly adelgid. Who wants to do any research on that?
Right.
Well, if you care about the hemlocks in the southeast, along the Appalachian chain, you care about that. So it's perfectly set up for the global Fleece Award, a lot of the research, you know.
I think this audience mostly is old enough to know what the Golden Fleece Award was.
Yeah. So
Proxmire, right?
Yeah, Proxmire's thing where identify something that sounds really silly, and then say we're going to eliminate that. And so I think that's what I was on the science committee. We saw a lot of good ideas, but they do get a little bit esoteric sounding, and so then it creates a great opportunity for sort of a populist lambast against that R&D, and so. Even in something like algae, it's something like, who wants to research algae? Well, actually, it's a really exciting thing, and so, but it takes some effort to communicate that.
In the Trump administration, they answered a question during President Trump's campaign, answered a question during the campaign from ScienceDebate.org, where they asked about the importance of research, and they issued a statement that was incredibly progressive and said that even when budgets are tight, we have to maintain our investments in basic science and even in academia. This is from the Trump campaign.
Right.
And it actually had a line about perhaps we should someday move beyond fossil fuels. The word perhaps made me think probably Donald Trump didn't actually write this statement, but he doesn't speak in perhaps things. But anyway, so there's this vision of a world that seems, so it doesn't seem to have to be bipartisan disinvestment, but we don't have a space race right now. I still wonder what could do it.
Yeah, it'd be great if climate change could launch a Sputnik, or if it could goose step through a red square somewhere. Then we would see the challenge, right? We'd rise to it. That's the issue in climate change.
I want to open this up to audience questions.
Can I jump in just
Yeah,
real
so
quick,
get your
because
questions in your heads, and I think there's a microphone that's going to roll.
I think that there's a really remarkable confluence of thinking, and you would think, environmental defense funds sitting next to Exxon, maybe there'd be 10%
take a picture.
overlap, and actually I think it's certainly above 50 and maybe close to 90.
Yeah. Well, and Exxon's finance research at Stanford and other places.
But I think that if you think about progress over the last 10 years and progress going forward, that is actually progress.
Yeah.
That we need to electrify, we need energy efficiency, we need to use clean sources to generate electricity, that we need to solve the problems of energy access, we need to address the issues of how do you fuel aviation. There's a lot of overlap there. I think maybe the only thing that I heard you say that I thought, well, I want to argue with you a little bit about that is maybe that when we think about electrifying as much as we can, because we know how to generate clean electricity, and we think about the people who don't yet have access to electricity, who are going to be that new middle class, how much of that, whether it's residential home, whether it's cooking, whether it's air conditioning, how much of that can be electrified? And I would hit the accelerator probably on electrification.
It can happen. Ecuador is an example where they've moved people from cooking on wood to cooking on LPG and now to cooking on electric because they have a lot of hydro.
Which is just huge progress. The other, if I could just add one more thought, I think the issue of research that you're tagging is so important. And it's, you asked what are the things that environmental groups can do. One of the things we do is talk about the importance of that when we don't have a stake in getting millions of dollars of federal money for doing our research. But the importance of that is not just for solving the climate problem. The importance of that is for the competitiveness of our country.
Right.
And if you think back to history and think about what happened in the early 70s, where the price shock on oil really created a turning point for American auto industry. I think that's what we're facing now with respect to energy. If you look at the investments that China is making, they're fantastic. And EDF works there with the Chinese government, and we're very supportive. But the hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in clean energy there, the mandates to put in place electrified vehicles more quickly and put in place incentives to make that happen are driving an industry there that is really going to eat our lunch. And that investment in research that you're talking about is going to be so important from a competitive point of view, not just from solving the climate change point of view.
Great.
$100 billion a year, and every year, $100 billion.
Right.
That's more than 36% of the world total
Yeah.
Right.
on clean energy.
All right, let's go to some questions here.
Right.
And say who you are and keep it a question.
And by the way, Diane, I'm from Britain, and we had a day last week when we generated zero electricity from
Coal, which is the
but-
home of the Industrial
yeah,
Revolution. It's amazing.
Absolutely. I mean, my observation from this absolutely brilliant discussion is first one of optimism. We can do it. But secondly, there's no one answer. That there isn't a Sputnik. We can't put a man on the moon. That there are so many different factors that we need something to tie it all together, and the one thing that does that very well is markets, and therefore the carbon tax seems to me to be the only thing that will bind it all together and get us there.
As long as we're not endlessly looking toward that and not actually finding a traction on how to get it done in full, American style
Carbon
places.
tax is pretty hard to design, actually.
Yeah.
When you start to look at it, but that's not to say we shouldn't try.
Yeah. There's a bunch of questions. Let's try to keep them quick. There and then up here in the front row. Maybe we'll take one or two.
Hi, my name is Paul Tullis. I write for climate and energy for the New York Times Magazine and Business Week and others. Mr. Inglis's revenue-neutral, border-adjustable carbon tax is eminently sensible. The problem is that the idea has been around for a long time, and it's revenue-neutral not to the oil companies. And so they have funded this massive disinformation campaign, which has led people to believe, it's a hoax, and Imhoff throwing a snowball on the floor of the Senate and all of this nonsense. And it seems to me that the problem is it's politically expedient for pseudo-populists to point fingers at pointy-headed academics and black glasses-wearing magazine writers, saying, you guys are the problem and you want to make us poor. It's not, I mean, this is an extreme example, but in the same way that Arab dictators look at Israel and blame Israel for their problems, how do you get around the fact that there are all these millions of people who actually believe that it's going to hurt them to pay for carbon and to internalize those negative externalities, and turn around all this political disinformation that's existed the last 30 years?
Can you hold on to that? Keep it energized and bubbled up, and let's get two more right here in the front row, and then we'll have. I don't know how much time we have left.
Quick question. So, Mr. Inglis, I live in Idaho. You're in South Carolina. My name's Amy Christensen Global, and the Sun Valley Institute. And I think there may be an opportunity for populism and conservatism to actually come together from rural America, in that we can localize our energy system, localize our food systems, create more jobs in rural America, and create support for action on climate change while making us more resilient to the climate impacts we're seeing. So I was curious about your perspective from being a Republican in South Carolina, seeing some of those opportunities to bring together libertarians and environmentalists around some of this. And then second, for Mr. Trelenberg, I was curious about carbon capture and utilization. You talked about sequestration, but it seems like as an investor, I see a lot of new technologies coming across to use that carbon, sequester it into use for building materials and other things. So those were my two questions.
Mentioned that too. Great. So two of those we'll just stop right here and say, okay, what do you think about those two?
Well, as to this, what we got to do is change the conversation. If you think about it, this is what conservatives heard. The godless scientist got together with the UN bureaucrats. They roped in the Wall Street traders, and they came up with a hopelessly...
What about the media?
Oh yeah, and you were writing about it. And they came up with a hopelessly complicated thing called cap and tax. And so there's nothing in that paragraph attractive to the people that you and I live among. So you got to change the conversation. And the conversation is about, do you believe in accountability? Do you believe that accountability underlies your whole political philosophy, even your faith tradition? And if so, then let's go with that. Let's go with that terminology, that language is a completely different language than the environmental left. The environmental left says walk and eat bugs, feel guilty, do with less. It's just not very attractive to the people I used to represent. So What you got to do is say we can have more energy, more mobility, more freedom.
Right.
And it's going to be exciting. We're going to sell distributed energy systems around the world. We're going to light up the world with more energy, more mobility, more freedom. And so we call ourselves energy optimist and climate realist. And it's important to put in that order.
Right.
If you do it the other way around, then we got to do with less. Well, that's just not very attractive. And besides, to get to scale that Pete's talking about, you got to be about this thing about doing this fast. And so just one small comment on the R&D. I'm a Republican, not a Libertarian. There used to be a difference. I'm for R&D. Libertarians, I realize some don't really cotton to that idea, but you got to find that line between where R&D stops and commercialization begins, and
right.
get the government out at the commercialization. That's what happened in cell phones and the internet and the PC, and that's why we've got them all in our pockets and they're affordable. If the government had attempted to do that, they'd be enormously expensive. We have several technicians following around, keeping us in touch with just our spouses. But in the agricultural thing, you put a price on carbon dioxide, you make all that waste in the pig farms of North Carolina and South Carolina a very attractive thing now. And so suddenly you've got opportunity coming in pig poo, for example. I mean, it's like you digesting that, you're turning it into an energy source.
So we have 3 minutes left. I'm not sure.
You want me to,
I know,
hey,
but
got
we have 3 minutes left. So
Okay.
I think, fuels,
I'll talk to
synthetic
you.
fuels from building things from carbon matters.
Yeah.
End of story. So let's. It's true. It's true. Let's get maybe one or two really quick thoughts. 3 minutes left.
Hi there, Letitia Cash from
Oh.
Exxon Client Earth. This is something that China's really embraced in terms of using innovation and to drive technology for climate solutions and mitigation emissions, is the role of green public procurement. Could you talk a bit about how that's an untapped resource, both in China and the US, where they could really start driving innovation to kickstart companies, new technologies, battery technologies, solar, to accelerate, carbon.
So government
carbon
procurement
reduction.
of stuff.
It's called
Yeah.
green public procurement.
Yeah, Obama's
Yes.
done a lot of that too. Right.
Yes, yes. I just wondered whether that's something where there's joined up thinking in China and the US.
Any quick thought?
I think that the green procurement is very important, but I think something you just touched on, which is I think the two countries can actually work together, which is work together on the basic science, on the innovation. And while the President Trump is cutting the budget for NSF, for EPA, China is increasing that a lot. The thing is, you have the first class top scientists here in this country, and I think you can actually find the better resource allocation by connecting the two together, right? I think that would really benefit the two sides and benefit the whole world.
So are there any last sort of 30-word mantra-style statements you want to make before we close this out?
I think we've got a lot of opportunity. I think a question I have for the next time we meet, what you described about and came through in a lot of these threads about the discussion. Every proposal that I know about starts with a market-based solution. And it seems to me, as someone who is apolitical about this, that it's a fight between a market-based solution and nothing at all. And as a scientist, I have a question of how much that confines the solution space or the opportunity for solutions. And I really agree with what was said, that the fact that we're from very diverse, heterogeneous backgrounds here on the panel, and basically everybody is in agreement on pretty much everything that was said, I think says something about where the thinking is, and that implies a lot of opportunity.
Boy, you know what? We're kind of out of time. I think we got a sense of what everyone's bringing to the table here. I do think we have a sense too, to my mind, again, looking at this the last 30 years and the next 30, one of the transitions society is slowly making is that this is not as simple as solving a crisis. This is not like an old pollution problem, which I think was a perception for a long time. It's a new issue that we will be grappling with for decades to come. It's emergent as we have public health, we have an environment, national security. They're issues we work on globally, locally, nationally, intellectually, and this has joined the mix. Our relationship with the climate system is a new thing. You know, it's different than weather. Weather is your personality, climate is your mood. Oh no, the other way around. Climate is your personality, weather is your mood. And it's going to take time. But my sense of hope is, in 1985, my first article on the climate and humans was about nuclear winter. This is like before global warming, 1985, in a science magazine, right? And the thing that's interesting and hopeful is that in 1985, a science magazine, their main source of income was ads from tobacco companies. So that says to me, things change. Sometimes it takes time. Patience and urgency are hard to combine, but I think everyone on this stage demonstrates that it's possible. So thank you very much. Onward.